En la montaña y el valle, la llanura tropical, el pueblo sufre y anhela paz, justicia y libertad. Todos juntos trabajemos y oremos al Señor. Levantemos la esperanza de un nuevo amanecer. Tú que diste a mi Bolivia las riquezas del Edén, ayúdanos a gozarlas con justicia y gratitud. Oh, mi tierra prometida, donde fluye leche y miel, su mesa brinda tendida para todos, oh Señor. Todos juntos trabajemos y oremos al Señor. Levantemos la esperanza de un nuevo amanecer. Ven Cristo a mi Bolivia, nace en cada corazón. Del Ande al Oriente reine tu poder liberador. Uniéndonos como hermanos, reconcílianos tu amor. Y suba desde esta tierra nuestro himno del loor. Todos juntos trabajemos y oremos al Señor. Levantemos la esperanza de un nuevo amanecer.
Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia. This is Episode 8, Educating the Elite and Laying the Groundwork for Revolution, Part B. I am David Stevenson. In the last episode, we began our discussion of early U.S. Methodist missionaries to Bolivia. I talked about the incredible challenges facing the missionaries to get to one of the most remote countries in the world at the time, and how it was often a one-way trip because missionaries and members of their families were often buried right there in La Paz. The ban on the evangelization of Protestantism was still in effect, and the law stated that the penalty was death. But the new liberal government simply ignored the law. However, Harrington and those U.S. missionaries who soon followed him had to be very, very careful. Wilson Boots writes, though no legal challenge had taken place that affected the illegal status of the newcomers, the small group of Protestants had the tacit protection of important elements in the government, and one Methodist official concluded, quote, without a doubt, the legal means existed to keep Protestantism out of Bolivia. There were also certain groups willing to use all kinds of pressures, but the government indifference to these pressures brought Protestantism to life. So the church did what the church always does when they enter a country that bans evangelism. They brought education. But it wasn't only proselytizing that was dangerous. Perhaps one of the most dangerous things you could do in Bolivia was to educate the indigenous. In the early years, educating an indigenous person how to read and write in Spanish was strictly illegal, and those who did faced arrest, exile, and even death threats, some of which were carried out. So Harrington began a small school for U.S. expatriates living in La Paz. Soon, government leaders began sending their kids to the missionary-run school. These government leaders were looking for someone to teach their children with a modern Western educational system and found it in the Methodist school. But it was small and underfunded, so the government made a tempting offer to Harrington: establish a Methodist school with state funding. Los's paper points out that Harrington recognized what an incredible opportunity this was. So Harrington personally took the risk of signing a 3-year agreement to manage 2 schools, one in La Paz and one in Oruro. And he did this before the Methodist Mission Society could formally accept the offer. But Harrington knew that he had to respond fast and not wait on bureaucratic red tape. Interestingly, a few years later, the government withdrew financial support from a Jesuit school and added it to the subsidy of the American Institutes. I'll bet that really upset the Catholic leadership. And Harrington had a very clear goal for the mission of the school. Losa quotes Harrington as saying, quote, "The country needs the liberator influence of the progressive Protestant schools, and this should be the way to slowly penetrate into the society." End quote. However, who were they going to educate? As we have seen, Bolivian society was strictly divided between the wealthy elite Criollo and Mestizo minorities and the oppressed, extremely impoverished indigenous majority. Do we teach the children of the rich or of the poor? Considering it was illegal to teach the indigenous and they had this incredible opportunity to receive government financial support along with the opportunity to charge a significant tuition to the families, the answer was simple. Losa quotes J.T. Copplestone, who states, quote, "The efforts of the mission were directly oriented toward the institutes of La Paz and Cochabamba, institutions that served almost exclusively the children of the families of the small upper class of Bolivian society. At the school at Cochabamba, the students came from the main families of the city and from the department of Cochabamba. The boys were from the homes of the governor, the elders, the chief of police, merchant leaders, and all the men of Congress. It is clear that missionary work of education was focused on the rich, powerful Criollo and Mestizo elite. The strategy of impacting Bolivian society would be carried out through the elite minority that had economic and political power. The two American institutes soon became by far the best schools in Bolivia and taught as many as 4,000 students at each school each year. These two schools were public schools which required tuition, yet were run by the Methodist Church and had students from the first grade through high school. U.S. missionaries were the administrators, controlled the curriculum, and chose the students. The school's tuition was extremely high. They utilized as many U.S. missionaries as teachers as possible, which provided the financial support needed by the U.S. missionaries while in Bolivia, and paid their Mestizo and Criollo teachers much more than what the government was paying. Consequently, they had the very best teachers. Their curriculum was similar to, but perhaps more rigorous than the best schools in the United States. They would even occasionally have a U.S. congressman or senator come and teach a short course at the high school. The dual organizational leadership and funding of the American Institute, led by both the Methodist Church and the Bolivian government, led to a whole set of deep underlying purposes which were complex and often contradictory, which led to failures in some areas. First, the government was looking for a school that could prepare additional teachers for the country and provide for well-qualified leaders to enter Bolivian society and industry. The school really didn't accomplish this goal very well. With the emphasis on teaching and utilizing English in all subjects, graduates of the American Institutes often struggled with the entrance exams into Bolivian universities, and this led to the eventual withdrawal of the government support for the American Institutes in 1916. However, with this education in English, I'm sure many graduates of the American Institutes got accepted into U.S. universities, which may have been the intent of the Criollo and Mestizo parents all along. One of the unintentional consequences of this is what is called brain drain. That is, where a country like the United States accepts the best and brightest students into U.S. universities, and they end up getting jobs and working in the United States instead of their own poor country, which needs them desperately. Second, we also have to realize that these early missionaries were captives of their own culture. They openly stated that they came not only to teach academic courses, but also to teach the ways of, quote, modern society, unquote, or what we would call the Western culture, and slowly remove, quote, traditional society, unquote. The students wore traditional Western-style private uniforms to go to school. Shoes were required instead of traditional sandals. They followed the clock. They learned of Western hygiene and Western foods and learned English and so on. Western culture was a requirement for the students. Third, these cultural changes fit right into some underlying political goals that were mostly unstated, but obvious when you look at them. There was a new movement called Pan-Americanism. Pan-Americanism was originally Bolivar's idea of uniting South America culturally and politically under the Grand Columbia banner. But during the two world wars, the U.S. promoted Pan-Americanism as a way to oppose first the fascist ideas of Nazi Germany and later the rise of communism. By the 1940s, Pan-Americanism claimed to be a hemisphere-wide movement when it actually was a U.S. political movement and foreign policy position. Several U.S. politicians commented that the American Institutes were bulwarks against communism in Bolivia. Edward A. Ross, professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin, visited the American Institutes when he was in South America in the early 20th century. Quoting from his book, which he wrote, he says, quote, "For example, take the American Institute planted in La Paz 5 years ago by the Methodist Board. Its teachers are models of piety, but no religious instruction is given. All the classes are conducted in English. The pupils come from the best families from all over the country. In 20 or 30 years, the lads it is educating will be leaders, and Bolivia will feel a stronger sympathy with American ideas and ideals than any other South American country," end quote. The American Institutes did have some limited success toward the goals of building closer relations to the United States and U.S. political and cultural values. But my question is whether the church should really be promoting those goals. Should U.S. missionaries be an arm of the American foreign policy? It obviously was in the middle of the 20th century. This added to the equating of the American culture to Christianity. And I believe that is a horrible corruption and even a heretical departure of the true Christian faith. Christ can be seen and lived in any culture, yet challenges every culture to improve and move toward the kingdom of God. And the final goal for the institutes that the church, especially the Mission Board of the United States Methodist Church, saw for the school was as an entry point into the lives of Bolivians and an opportunity to evangelize and bring converts into the church. But many of the missionaries themselves didn't necessarily wholeheartedly agree with this purpose. They felt the purpose should be to show Christ's love to all people in improving their lives, and that it be their Christian witness which drew people into the faith. The end result was very, very few of the students or their families ever joined the Methodist Church. There is some dispute about how interested Harrington and the other missionaries were in reaching out and evangelizing the indigenous of Bolivia. At times, the American Institute has been criticized by the Methodist leadership in New York for not harvesting more members. The defense of the U.S. teachers and administrators was that the American Institutes were educational institutions and were not founded for evangelism. They believed that by living their authentic Christian life and example, students and families would be drawn into the faith without actively proselytizing. But the Catholic Church remained very hostile to the American Institutes and even excommunicated some Catholic families from the church because they sent their young children to the school. Harrington did try to start a little church. He gathered some of the students and parents of the school for Bible reading and singing hymns, but he did not organize a church. Interestingly, a local Catholic priest named Eloy Rodriguez started attending. Eventually, Mr. Rodriguez renounced his Catholic ordination and became a Methodist. At the first quarterly conference, which is kind of like an annual conference or a general assembly, they reported that there were no Methodist churches, but they did appoint Pastor Rodriguez as a local pastor, and he spoke English, Spanish, and Aymara. Despite being either a Criollo or Mestizo, he was the first Bolivian Methodist pastor or missionary who could speak Aymara. It appears that there really wasn't a great amount of interest in working with the indigenous in those early years. There was no attempt to educate them during the first 5 decades of the 20th century. The somewhat intentional, somewhat unintentional consequences of this education was to promote Western culture at the expense of the native cultures swirling around the missionaries in Bolivia. And when the church would finally begin to reach out to the indigenous, this cultural elitism and equating Western culture with Christian values became much more intense and much more destructive to the indigenous cultures. However, it is my belief that despite the embedded cultural and racial elitism that existed within the missionaries, God's plan passed through Harrington and the other missionaries, and it actually worked. It just took a very long time to transform Bolivia. And the American Institutes were not the only ones teaching this more liberal and anti-clerical education. The Escuela Normal de Sucre, the Normal School of Sucre, was also part of this social and educational movement inside of Bolivia. 45 years after the opening of the American Institute in 1952, two 1930 graduates of the American Institutes of La Paz and Cochabamba became leaders of a democratic movement which radically transformed Bolivia. Victor Paz Estenssoro and Hernan Silas Suazo founded the Revolutionary National Movement Party, or MNR, and wrestled the presidency away from a military junta which was in power. The Constitution only allowed one 4-year term for a president, and these two men traded the presidency back and forth between them for 12 years. They also, both, at various times, faced ouster, arrest, and exile from right-wing military dictatorships, which overthrew their elected governments. In fact, Suazo was re-elected president when the country finally came to democratic elections in 1982, and following the end of a series of military coups which were involved in the arrest and torture of Methodists. Victor Paz Estenssoro became president of Bolivia in 1952. He and his party, MNR, decreed the Agrarian Reform Law, which abolished forced labor of the indigenous people. And most importantly, the local indigenous communities that had had their land taken away from them by the Spanish and were living under the Hacienda Patron form of forced labor were now authorized to retake their land from the patrons. They had farmed the land for millennia and had it stolen from them by the conquistadors and the criollo, and now the government said, take it back. However, many patrons violently resisted the land reform law and hired thugs to intimidate the peons into continuing the hacienda system. This led to Paz Estenssoro and MNR to create the Ministry of Peasant Affairs, which helped organize the communities to fight for their land. The government even gave many communities arms to fight for control for their lands, and since many of the campesinos had served in the army during the Chaco War, they knew how to use them. However, in the Santa Cruz area and elsewhere, patrons stayed in control of their haciendas by paying below subsistence wages to their workers and the use of intimidation such as hired thugs to beat the indigenous on their haciendas who demanded the freedom that the new law dictated. But this land reform became the first step toward equality for the indigenous. It broke up many but not all of the hacienda patron systems of farming, especially in the Altiplano area and areas where the Aymara lived. The land was broken up and returned to the villagers who had farmed it for centuries. The indigenous rural people were no longer peons working for a patron, but were now called campesinos, or simply rural people. The indigenous peoples were now citizens, at least nominally. They were given the right to vote along with women. They could now go anywhere they wanted to in the cities. La Paz has a beautiful plaza where all of the main government buildings are and where the wealthiest patrons had their mansions. Previously, indigenous people were forbidden and even arrested or shot if they entered the Plaza Murillo in La Paz. Now they could go and see the wealth of the country. Educating the indigenous was now legal, although deeply frowned upon by the elite and often blocked when possible. Again, this started the momentum of equality for human rights for all the indigenous people and women of Bolivia. Why the sudden change by the elite? Why would one of their own, joined by others, create a party and turn against the Hacienda Patron Peon system after nearly 400 years of economic and political dominance. I and others from the IMB believe that it is highly likely that their ideas of equality came from their time at the American Institute. The teachers, both the U.S. missionaries and the national teachers at the American Institutes of La Paz and Cochabamba, communicated the beliefs of equality and compassion to the young students, who grew up to be leaders of the M&R party and brought about the land reform. In fact, when Dr. Hernan Silas Suazo was president from 1956 to 1960, he stated that the directors and teachers of the American Institute in La Paz, where he attended his youth, were largely responsible for his ideals of social reform. President Silas Suazo was awarded a medal for being the most outstanding graduate of the American Institute in its 50-year history. Assuming that it is true that the American Institutes helped develop the minds and thoughts of these two great democratic leaders of Bolivia, then the early missionaries had a huge impact on Bolivian culture, the lives of all indigenous people in Bolivia, and of all women, no matter what color they were. The missionaries were well aware that they were training the future leaders of Bolivia, and while, as we will see, the missionaries struggled to overcome their own cultural elitism and racial prejudices, still somehow the gospel's belief in inclusion and acceptance came through. Consequently, I believe it is fair to say that those early Methodist missionaries were critical in the beginning of the collapse of the horrid Hacienda Patron Peon economic and indentured servitude system of Bolivia. Through education brought by Methodist missionaries and the values of love and compassion taught in the American Institutes, the missionaries transformed the hearts of some of the children of the elite. And just as God had spoken to Hareton, quote, the liberator influence of the American Institutes became the way to slowly penetrate Bolivian society, unquote. These schools continued their important work clear up to today, with some very important modifications which we will talk about later. Later on, we will hear how Herman Crespo was a mestizo Catholic who attended the American Institute and how he was drawn to the values of inclusiveness and faith, was baptized in the Methodist Church in high school, and later became a leader of the IMB and a fighter for human rights of the indigenous. Now for yet another controversial issue about the American Institute. Ray Burns wrote a research paper for his Master's of Arts degree in history at Oklahoma Agriculture and Mechanical College, now called Oklahoma State University, entitled The American Institute in La Paz, Bolivia. He wrote it in 1938. Burns seems to have no personal contact with the school, but among other research, he sent questionnaires to several of its current and former U.S. teachers and missionaries. In those reports, he was told very vivid stories of indigenous families begging to have their children admitted to the schools, being accepted, and going on to becoming professionals in Bolivia, which all sounds very good, especially if this is before 1938. However, the Aymara former Bishop Eugenio Poma was sent to the American Institute as a sixth grade student in 1968 and was told by the missionaries, teachers, and administrators of the American Institute that he was the second fully indigenous person to attend the American Institute. And when he graduated from high school, they announced that he was the second indigenous person to get a high school diploma in all of Bolivia. When I asked Bishop Poma about these stories of indigenous students being admitted in the American Institute in the 1930s or earlier, he felt that it simply could not be true. First of all, it was still illegal, punishable by death, to educate the indigenous. And second of all, after the Chaco War, because the indigenous who fought the war had left their little rural villages for the first time and seen a bigger world, the Criollo felt more than ever the fear of an uprising by the indigenous. Therefore, they clamped down harder, blocking any efforts to educate the indigenous. Eugenio was certain that no indigenous were admitted in the 1920s to the 1940s, and strongly doubts there were any before 1920. The stories were most likely stories of high-placed mestizo families getting their kids into the school, which was all white or criollo at the time. And it was a big concession to let the so-called half-breeds into the school. But over the years, the acceptance of mestizos into the American institutes became more and more acceptable. I suspect that the teachers who were questioned by Burns recognized that saying no indigenous students were ever admitted to the schools sounded incredibly racist, which in fact it was. So they intentionally revised history and turned the story of a mestizo child into one of an indigenous child. You will be hearing more about the bullying and teasing Eugenio received as an indigenous student at the American Institute when we get to his story in a few months. There was a school for the indigenous started by the Baptists in Warisata on the Altiplano, but it was soon shut down by the government. So there once again is this giant ugly thread of racism. The American Institute, founded in 1906, owned and operated by the Board of Missions of the Methodist Church in the United States, this institution never admitted an indigenous student for over 5 decades. Yes, there were times when it would have been illegal to do so, but there were other times when the school could have admitted indigenous students without repercussions. And there were very, very few attempts to educate the indigenous secretly. And those missionaries who did try to teach them secretly were often punished by the church. In fact, our next 2 podcasts will be about these courageous missionaries who fought oftentimes alone for educating and evangelizing the indigenous of Bolivia. So you can see there is this wonderful history of education brought by the missionaries and local teachers at the American Institute, which radically changed Bolivia to become a more open and inclusive society, and yet it is also mixed with the ugly racism and cultural elitism of the American missionaries. That is why it is such a divisive topic in the IMB and among former missionaries. When I first arrived in Bolivia in 1987, I watched as students dropped their children off in front of the Methodist-run American Institute in La Paz early in the morning. The parents were driving Mercedes, Porsches, and even Humvees. These were, without a doubt, the children of the elite. They were and are receiving an education that challenges them to be more inclusive in their thinking and in their actions. The American Institutes today has approximately 7,000 students each. As a postscript, I also want to mention the mixed role the United States government played in all of this. On the one hand, Cole Blazer called the 1952 Bolivian Revolution, quote, the only genuine social revolution in which the United States provided early and sustained support, unquote. Wow, that's a pretty amazing comment. However, its motives were mixed as the U.S. saw this land reform as a way to moderate the movement and keep it from leading to a communist regime in the 1950s. And it needs to be pointed out that the land reform did not get completely carried out. Even today, there are haciendas with huge land holdings who never redistributed their lands to the indigenous people who have lived there for millennia. This is especially true in Santa Cruz area, where huge tracts of the Amazon have been destroyed by Hispanic, North American, and Central European immigrants for cattle ranches and soy production. And they continue to exploit the indigenous who live and work on these haciendas, often paying them less than $6 a day. There is a well-known and well-documented story that happened this year during the previous government, the one that just got voted out of office and was replaced by an Armara president. Branko Marinkovic is a Croatian immigrant to Bolivia and had more than 20,000 hectares on his hacienda in Santa Cruz area, which had not been redistributed. He had held on to it using the methods described earlier. The hacienda named Yasminka was owned by Marinkovic's sister and included over 12,000 hectares and was one of the lands recovered in the land redistribution. The government turned that land over not to individuals, but as per indigenous thinking, they turned it over to the Central Organization of National Pueblos of the Guayarios to be managed by the whole Guayarios community. The Morales administration, through the Vice Ministry of Land, had begun to fight in the courts to recover and redistribute the lands of the Marinkovic Hacienda and have it returned to the Guayayo people also. This land is called Laguna Corazon and is also located in the Guayayos people's area. But up to the beginning of this year, Marinkovic had managed to get the transfer hung up in the courts, which is still, to this day, not come to a conclusion, but it is clearly the law. Marinkovic's response was to become the president of the Santa Cruz Civic Committee in 2006. The Santa Cruz Civic Committee, together with its armed wing, the fascist Union Juvenil Crucenista, used the motto, Coya's Cursed Race, led a racist and xenophobic movement against the Aymara people. By the way, the word Coya is a rude and racist title for indigenous people from the highlands, in other words, for the Aymara. The Santa Cruz Civic Committee led an aggressive and sometimes violent resistance to the Morales government. If you followed any of my posts on the political situation in Bolivia, you know that Janine Áñez became president of Bolivia earlier this year when Evo stepped down under political pressure. President Áñez started out fine just being a caretaker president until there were new elections, but she began to replace all the ministers in the cabinet with right-wing people tied to previously anti-democratic and anti-indigenous governments. One of her appointees was Branko Marinkovic as the Minister of Economy, and it has become public that despite the courts having not come to a legal conclusion about who owns the land, in September 2020, the Áñez government instructed that the ownership of these two lands would now be consolidated and given to Branko Marinkovic. This means that over 32,000 hectares of land, which had been a part of the land of the indigenous tribe, the Guayayos, for millennia, is being handed over to Marinkovic for his hacienda, even though there aren't supposed to be any haciendas anymore, according to Bolivian law. There's a list for my sources for this episode at the website www.weavingtheblanket.com and click on the episode and you will find a list of sources there. I also want to thank Juan Covarrubias, former head of the American Institute in Cochabamba, Eugenio Poma, in Gustavo Losa, in consulting and reviewing my report. But I want to be clear, the opinions that I have expressed in this episode are my opinions and my opinions only, and does not necessarily represent their views on these same facts. Next week, you will hear about one particular missionary, James Wimberg. Wimberg developed a successful and growing mission among the Aymara of the Altiplano. There was also a successful attempt to stop him and punish him by the U.S. Missionary District Superintendent, who also encouraged patrons to use the whip against their peons, and who eventually convinced the bureaucracy of the Board of Missions of the Methodist Church to remove Wimberg from the field. I've always had a great affinity for James Wimberg, whose lifelong journey 100 years ago parallels my own journey in many ways. Remember that you can send your comments or thoughts about this episode either directly to me by mail at tulsadstevenson@yahoo.com or through the comment area connected to this episode on the website www.weavingtheblanket.com or in the comments on YouTube. I'll see you in 2 weeks.